A new kind of heat is rising, and it can kill you even if you're in the shade, even if there's a breeze, even if you're drinking water. It's called wet bulb heat. Scientists say it's one of the most dangerous effects of climate change. And by 2 degrees Celsius of global warming, it's expected to hit many of the most crowded places on Earth. Here's what it is, why it's so deadly, and what we can actually do about it. Most of the deadliest heat waves in history have been dry heat waves, but a different, possibly deadlier kind of heat is now on the rise. Extreme humid heat, known to scientists as wet bulb events. These events used to be rare. New research shows that once the planet crosses 2 degrees Celsius of warming, many of the world's most populated regions are likely to face them directly. And when that happens, there's only one real way to stay safe: cooling the environment artificially. So what happens if that's not possible? Consider the power grid. The single day of the year that places the highest stress on electrical infrastructure is almost always the hottest day of the year, precisely because so many people are running air conditioning at the same time. That surge in demand is exactly when the system is most likely to fail. It's a cruel kind of timing. The day the grid is most likely to break down is the exact day people need it most. Now layer in the possibility of an additional extreme weather event during that same period. What happens if a tropical cyclone arrives and knocks out power at the same moment a wet bulb heat wave is unfolding? Suddenly, the one tool capable of protecting people from lethal heat, active cooling, disappears at the worst possible moment. These are not hypothetical disconnected risks. They are compounding hazards, and they are becoming a growing concern as the planet moves toward higher levels of warming. This is what makes wet bulb heat fundamentally different from the kinds of heat waves most people have grown up hearing about. A dry heat wave is dangerous, but it leaves the body's own defenses intact. Sweat still evaporates. The body can still, at least partially, cool itself down. A wet bulb event takes that defense away entirely. It is heat that attacks the one mechanism the human body relies on most to survive high temperatures in the first place. To understand why humid heat poses such a unique danger, it helps to first understand how it differs from the dry heat most people are more familiar with. Dry heat waves are typically driven by large high-pressure systems that trap a hot air near the surface of the Earth. These systems push air downward, and as that air is compressed, it heats up through a process known as adiabatic heating. When a high-pressure system becomes stuck in place, heat builds day after day, with no clouds and no wind to help carry it away. This is exactly the mechanism behind 2 of the most notorious dry heat events of the past several decades: the 2003 European heat wave and the 2021 Pacific Northwest heat dome. Humid heat works differently, and it is closely tied to a basic physical principle. As temperatures rise, the atmosphere is able to hold significantly more moisture. This means that in any location where air temperatures are climbing due to ongoing climate change and where there is a nearby source of moisture, humidity is also likely to rise alongside temperature. The two are not separate problems. They are increasingly linked, which is exactly why scientists expect humid heat events to become more common, not less, as warming continues. Where dry heat waves depend on a stagnant high-pressure system sitting in place for days, humid heat is tied more directly to the background climate itself. As the planet's baseline temperature rises, the atmosphere's capacity to hold moisture rises with it. That means the ingredients for a dangerous wet bulb event become more available almost everywhere. There's a source of moisture nearby, whether that's a coastline, a river basin, or simply humid regional air. The danger of this combination was made devastatingly clear in 2015 when one of the most extreme humid heat events on record struck Karachi, Pakistan. Temperatures reached up to 45 degrees Celsius, and that heat combined with oppressive humidity to create conditions that were already lethal on their own. But the crisis was made even worse by power outages and water shortages. To understand why humidity turns heat lethal, it's important to understand how the human body cools itself in the first place. Humans primarily regulate their internal temperature by sweating. Sweat sits on the skin and evaporates, and that evaporation process carries heat away from the body. But when the surrounding air is already humid, sweat cannot evaporate as efficiently because the air is already saturated with moisture and has less capacity to absorb more. As a result, the body cannot cool itself as effectively, no matter how much a person sweats. This is precisely where the concept of wet bulb temperature becomes essential. Wet bulb temperature is a single number that combines both heat and humidity, and it gives scientists a way to understand when conditions cross the line from merely uncomfortable into genuinely dangerous or even lethal. The wet sock at the tip of a wet bulb thermometer behaves in a way that closely mirrors human skin. Water evaporates from the wet sock in the same way that sweat evaporates from wet human skin. In both cases, that evaporation is what carries heat away into the surrounding environment. But the more humid the surrounding air already is, the harder and less efficient that evaporation becomes. This means that evaporative cooling, whether from a wet bulb thermometer or from human skin, becomes less and less effective as both temperature and humidity rise together. And it's part of the reason scientists have worked hard to better understand exactly how humid heat affects the human body and where the true physical limits of human tolerance actually lie. Identifying those dangerous wet bulb thresholds is not a simple task, largely because testing them is inherently dangerous. Researchers cannot ethically place a person into a heat chamber and push their body to the point of genuine harm just to observe the outcome. What researchers can do, carefully and incrementally, is raise both temperature and humidity in a controlled setting while measuring a person's core body temperature, watching closely for the exact point at which that core temperature begins to climb in an uncontrolled way. That threshold is what scientists call the limit of compensability. A recent study set out specifically to summarize the most current, state-of-the-art estimates of these thresholds across the scientific literature. What that research found is that there is a range rather than a single fixed number. Uncompensable wet bulb temperatures fall somewhere between about 19 and 32 degrees Celsius. The reason this threshold spans such a wide range from 19 to 32 degrees Celsius wet bulb is that it depends on a combination of variables: a person's activity level, the exact air temperature, the humidity level, and the person's age. It's important to understand how the human body cools itself in the first place. Humans primarily regulate their internal temperature by sweating. Sweat sits on the skin and evaporates, and that evaporation process carries heat away from the body. But when the surrounding air is already humid, sweat cannot evaporate as efficiently because the air is already saturated with moisture and has less capacity to absorb more. As a result, the body cannot cool itself as effectively, no matter how much a person sweats. This is precisely where the concept of wet bulb temperature becomes essential. Wet bulb temperature is a single number that combines both heat and humidity, and it gives scientists a way to understand when conditions cross the line from merely uncomfortable into genuinely dangerous or even lethal. The wet sock at the tip of a wet bulb thermometer behaves in a way that closely mirrors human skin. Water evaporates from the wet sock in the same way that sweat evaporates from wet human skin. In both cases, that evaporation is what carries heat away into the surrounding environment. But the more humid the surrounding air already is, the harder and less efficient that evaporation becomes. This means that evaporative cooling, whether from a wet bulb thermometer or from human skin, becomes less and less effective as both temperature and humidity rise together. And it's part of the reason scientists have worked hard to better understand exactly how humid heat affects the human body and where the true physical limits of human tolerance actually lie. Identifying those dangerous wet bulb thresholds is not a simple task, largely because testing them is inherently dangerous. Researchers cannot ethically place a person into a heat chamber and push their body to the point of genuine harm just to observe the outcome. What researchers can do, carefully and incrementally, is raise both temperature and humidity in a controlled setting while measuring a person's core body temperature, watching closely for the exact point at which that core temperature begins to climb in an uncontrolled way. That threshold is what scientists call the limit of compensability. A recent study set out specifically to summarize the most current, state-of-the-art estimates of these thresholds across the scientific literature. What that research found is that there is a range rather than a single fixed number. Uncompensable wet bulb temperatures fall somewhere between about 19 and 32 degrees Celsius. The reason this threshold spans such a wide range from 19 to 32 degrees Celsius wet bulb is that it depends on a combination of variables: a person's activity level, the exact air temperature, the humidity level, and the person's age. During the 2003 European heatwave, up to 3,400 people died in Paris alone. Under a warming scenario of 2 degrees Celsius, which again could arrive within a couple of decades, researchers found that heat waves of this severity would no longer be once-a-century events in Paris. Instead, they would occur once every few years. And even though the 2003 heat wave ranks among the deadliest in recent history, it never actually came close to crossing the dangerous wet bulb thresholds discussed throughout this analysis. The 2015 Karachi heat wave, by contrast, did cross that line. It passed the uncompensable wet bulb threshold for older adults for roughly 8 to 10% of the event's total duration. Now, project that same kind of event forward. At 2 degrees Celsius of global warming, models show that the uncompensable threshold would be crossed not just for older adults, but for younger, healthier adults as well. And at 4 degrees Celsius of warming, models show that an event equivalent to the 2015 Karachi heat wave would cross the uncompensable threshold for older adults during roughly 90% of the heat wave's duration. Think about what that shift actually represents. An event that already killed at least 200 people while crossing the dangerous threshold for less than a tenth of its duration could, under higher levels of warming, spend nearly the entire event beyond that same threshold. The margin for survival that existed in 2015, however narrow, would largely disappear. There is one detail about these critical wet bulb thresholds that deserves to be repeated clearly, because it is the single most important fact in this entire discussion. Once a person crosses one of these thresholds, the only way to bring their internal body temperature back down is by actively cooling either themselves or their surrounding environment. It doesn't matter how much breeze is available. It doesn't matter how much shade a person has access to. It doesn't matter how much water they are drinking. None of those traditional coping strategies are sufficient once this threshold is crossed. The only effective countermeasure is active cooling of the environment itself. This is precisely why air conditioning stands out as the single most important adaptation and protection measure currently available to humanity against this specific threat. And yet, even though air conditioning is one of the most critical tools for surviving extreme heat, it is far from a perfect or complete solution for several interconnected reasons. The first problem is cost. Air conditioning is energy intensive, and as the climate continues to warm, a growing number of people simply will not be able to afford to keep their homes cool. This financial barrier means that the populations most vulnerable to deadly heat are often the same populations least likely to have reliable access to air conditioning in the first place. The second problem is that air conditioning does not eliminate heat, it simply relocates it. Cooling an indoor space means transferring that heat outside, which in turn warms the surrounding outdoor air. In dense urban environments, this transferred heat compounds the existing urban heat island effect, making outdoor conditions in cities even hotter than they would otherwise be. The third problem is structural, and it goes beyond individual affordability. Even in a hypothetical scenario where every single person could afford air conditioning, that alone would not solve the underlying problem. Power grids, both in the United States and globally, were not designed with the assumption that everyone would run their cooling system simultaneously. During heat waves, this mismatch between demand and infrastructure capacity makes widespread power outages significantly more likely. And when the grid fails during a heat wave, it is the most vulnerable people who are placed at the greatest risk. This creates a troubling loop. The hotter it gets, the more people need air conditioning. The more people run air conditioning at once, the more strain is placed on the grid. The more strain placed on the grid, the more likely an outage becomes, precisely on the days when losing power is most dangerous. And because wet bulb events remove the fallback options people would normally use during a power outage, no shade, no breeze, and no amount of water can substitute for it, a grid failure during a genuine wet bulb event isn't just inconvenient. It can be the difference between a manageable heat wave and a lethal one. If air conditioning units are functioning as the primary line of defense protecting people from dangerous heat, then the moment the power system fails, whether from the grid being overloaded by demand or from additional weather-driven infrastructure damage, people are placed in immediate danger. And these compounding hazards, such as a heat wave striking in the aftermath of a hurricane, represent a growing area of concern as the planet moves toward unprecedented levels of warming. As extreme weather events across the board become more frequent and more severe, these overlapping crises become more likely, not less. There's also a deeper irony embedded in this entire situation, one that researchers are actively studying. The more society relies on air conditioning to survive extreme heat, the more that reliance could end up fueling the very problem driving the heat in the first place. If air conditioning were built out on a massive global scale purely to manage heat risk, that expansion would carry a real cost in terms of carbon emissions, and those emissions could in turn feed back into rising global temperatures, worsening the very conditions air conditioning is meant to solve. Right now, air conditioning already accounts for approximately 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And according to the International Energy Agency, the total number of air conditioning units in use worldwide is expected to nearly triple by the year 2050, driving a massive increase in global energy demand. That tripling isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening because more of the world is entering the exact conditions this analysis has been describing. Hotter baseline temperatures, more humid air, and a growing recognition that active cooling is no longer optional in many regions. It's a matter of survival. So, what is the resolution to this paradox where the primary tool for surviving deadly heat also risks accelerating the warming that causes it? The most direct answer is a transition toward clean energy, and doing so as quickly as possible. If the growing global demand for air conditioning is going to be met without simultaneously accelerating climate change, then the power grids supplying that air conditioning need to be powered by renewable energy sources. Without that shift, the world risks solving one crisis by quietly deepening another, meeting today's heat emergency with a solution that guarantees tomorrow's heat emergency is worse. Of course, clean energy alone is not the entire solution. There is a great deal that can and should be done beyond simply expanding access to air conditioning. Cities can be redesigned with heat resilience in mind, through measures like white or green roofs that reflect or absorb less heat, and through expanded urban tree planting to provide natural shade and cooling. These kinds of design choices work alongside air conditioning rather than replacing it, reducing how much artificial cooling is needed in the first place by lowering the baseline heat load a city has to deal with. Communities can invest in more cooling centers, giving people without home air conditioning somewhere safe to go during extreme heat events. This matters most for exactly the population already identified as most vulnerable: older adults, people with cardiovascular or respiratory conditions, and anyone without reliable access to air conditioning at home. Electrical grids can be upgraded to be more resilient against the kind of demand surges and infrastructure damage that heat waves and extreme weather events tend to cause, directly addressing the grid failure risk described earlier. And protection efforts can be intentionally prioritized toward the most vulnerable populations during heat waves, including older adults and those with existing cardiovascular or respiratory conditions, ensuring that limited resources during an emergency reach the people who need them most urgently. None of these measures, on their own, fully solves the problem. But together, clean energy, smarter urban design, expanded cooling centers, more resilient grids, and targeted protection for the most vulnerable form a layered defense against a threat that, as the science shows, cannot be defeated by any single strategy alone. The honest truth is that humanity is heading into genuinely uncharted territory. Wet bulb events that were once rare are on track to become common across some of the most densely populated regions of the planet. The margin between survivable and unsurvivable heat, once thought to be a distant, almost theoretical concern, is now measurable, mapped, and moving closer with every fraction of a degree of additional warming. But there is another truth sitting right alongside that first one, and it matters just as much. How bad this ultimately gets is still, at least in part, a choice. The thresholds are known, the at-risk regions have been mapped, and the tools, from clean energy to resilient grid infrastructure to smarter urban design, already exist. What happens next depends on how quickly and how seriously those tools are put to use.